I am a quinoa crust, and I look so good, and I'm really crispy too. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Bake It Up a Notch Bite Size. This is a super fun episode because it's something I have been dying to talk to all of you out there in the internet universe about for well over a year. This is something I came up with and I've been working on for years and years and years, and I was so excited to put it in my cookbook, The Book on Pie. Unfortunately, the book on pie was getting a little bit too big and I had to make some tough cuts. So I'm very excited today to bring you this concept. So today, what are we talking about? Grain crusts. This is one of the first recipes I put up when I started working as a contributor for Food 52 way back in 2014. And I used rice for that particular crust. But what is so cool about this method is it really works with any kind of leftover cooked grain you have on hand. Rice, grains like bulgur, quinoa, or even things like pasta, couscous, orzo. All of these things work really beautifully to make this style of crust. This opens up a ton of possibilities because that means that you can make crusts that are naturally gluten-free. You can make crusts that are a little bit healthier, maybe using some whole grains, or you can just use up some leftovers that you've got on hand, remixing them in a cool new way. And best of all, it could not be any easier. This is about as simple as it gets in the kitchen. So let's get baking. First step, we need some cooked grains. So this, like I said, is a great thing to do with leftover grains. I'm gonna go ahead and just put them into my bowl. This is just basmati rice, leftover basmati rice. I'm gonna go ahead and season it with some salt and pepper. We're also gonna add to it a pretty generous amount of grated Parmesan cheese. You can totally leave this cheese out. However, the cheese does serve as a binder in this recipe. So if you are gonna leave it out, just be sure that you're thinking of that. You may wanna opt to use a little more of the other binder in this recipe, which is egg white. If you don't wanna use eggs or you have an egg allergy, a flaxseed egg replacer works great here. We just need something that's gonna serve as that kind of protein to help bond this together along with the starches. So I've got my egg white. I'm just gonna whisk it a little bit to help break it up. This is just something I like to do. It makes it easier to incorporate into all of those grains that we've got. Perfect. You don't need to go crazy with whisking it. Just whisk it enough to kind of loosen it up, and we're just gonna go ahead and pour that over everything and stir it to combine. Just kind of stir it enough until you get all of the grains of rice or whatever grain you're using, hydrated with a little bit of that, not hydrated, coated with a little bit of that egg white. And then we're just going to go ahead and press it into our tart pan. So that is actually one thing that's different about the grain crust versus a standard pie crust. Most of the time with pie and tart crust, you are not greasing the pie plate in any way. We do want to grease it in this case because the starches that are in these cooked grains, they're going to be prone to sticking. So now we can just go ahead and dump the whole crust into our greased pie plate. And it looks like a lot right now, but we're going to compress it a little bit. I've got a greased, this is a 1/4 cup measure, and I just used a little nonstick spray. I'm gonna start by just using it to push some towards the sides and kind of even out the bottom. Don't worry if you see holes at this stage, just start by getting it a little bit rough in the right shape. The cool thing about these grain crusts is they're really adaptable. You can easily adjust them for slightly larger sizes of pans. You can make them a little bit thicker if you want a heartier crust, or you can keep them nice and thin like a classic pie crust. I typically keep the base thinner like a classic pie crust and then make it a little thicker along the sides just so I have a little of that extra grain heft and help supporting the sides. But really whatever you want to do works. I do strongly recommend par baking these crusts. It helps the whole mixture set and have a little bit of structure before you add any kind of wet ingredient into it. I'm gonna par bake this grain crust at 375 degrees Fahrenheit until it gets just lightly browned around the very top edge. That'll be enough to ensure that the structure is set, and then it'll be ready to fill with whatever kind of filling I can dream up. now that we talked about using grains, I used rice. I have another one I'm gonna bring out that I used quinoa. Let's talk about one that's like really craveable and also a really good remix, because a lot of people don't know how to use leftover pasta. And leftover pasta, if you think that it's not as good when it's reheated, it makes a really great crust, if you can believe it. So I have here some small pasta. This is great for leftovers, but of course you can also do it with a pasta you specifically pick. I love using something a little bit on the smaller side here, or even crumbling up a larger piece of pasta so that it's easier to pack it in. I'm gonna add just a little bit of olive oil to it. Now this one I'm just eyeballing. I'm not following the rule of the egg white. I'm not actually gonna use egg whites at all. I'm just gonna use some butter and some oil. We're gonna kind of lean into the fact that when pasta is cooked twice, it gets really crisp the second time. So we don't necessarily need the help of the egg white to bind, especially if we use a little bit extra cheese to bring it all together. So I'm gonna use some Parmesan in here. We'll do a handful or so. There's a big handful. I'm liking this already. You can add any other seasonings to this that you wanted. It would be fun to make it like a little bit spicy, or a little bit like some herbs in it would be really good. And then we can go ahead and dump it into our pie plate. I've got my greased cup measure. Just gonna do the same thing. First, I'll start by just kind of evening out the base, pushing the grain towards the outside, and then we can focus on getting those sides a little more even. Okay, what's cool about this is because the pasta is gonna cook a little bit quicker, you can do the same thing. You can par bake it, or we can go ahead and fill it now. I think I'm gonna give it a quick par bake, and then I'm gonna fill it with some leftover sausage, tomato, and fresh mozzarella cheese. Just kind of plop all of that in there, and it's gonna come out as this gooey, crisp pasta pie. It's gonna be amazing. Our rice crust that I made earlier has finished par baking. It's only lightly browned at the edges, and the biggest thing that you can see is that it's dried out. You know, it's a little bit stiffer to the touch, which is perfect. We're gonna let it cool completely, just because if we try to pour some kind of filling into it while it's still hot, it could disrupt the crust. It's still not totally set, remember? And also that heat could translate into our filling and just kind of lead to an undesirable result. So just give it that time to cool. Then you can fill it with really whatever kind of pie filling you want. I'm gonna do some kale and tomatoes, like my recipe for the rice crust on Food 52. It's a real simple quiche. I'm gonna do some kale in the bottom, and then a few sliced tomatoes, some more kale. I always like to pile the vegetables into a quiche first, because then the custard, it's easy to pour it all over and just kind of let it nestle in. Perfect. Okay, now I'm just gonna pour my quiche custard over it. You do wanna pour it slowly because that grain crust is a little bit porous. So you don't wanna get too close to the edges, because we don't wanna overflow and have something like quiche custard go over the edge. It could make our mixture stick to the pan a little bit if we're not careful. So just pour gradually, a little bit at a time, let it kind of sink in, so to speak, and then keep pouring. Perfect. Now this is ready to go back into the oven until our quiche filling is just set, just kind of how you would bake it once you were using a regular pie crust as well. So this is gonna take about another 30 minutes in the oven, and while it's doing that, why don't we assemble the rest of our pasta pie? I've got my pasta crust here. This had my little pastina, the tiny, tiny pasta that you sometimes use in soup, made into a crust. I par baked it. I filled it with some leftover tomato sauce and sausage that I have. I'm gonna top it with a little bit of some cubed fresh mozz, just using some stuff up that I've got in my fridge. And then we're gonna return this to the oven. We're gonna bake it until that pasta is really, really browned and crisp. And we ideally want that filling to be like bubbly. We're gonna let this bake. And when we come back, I'm gonna show you all 3 of my different grain crusts, and, just how delicious and amazing they look. Let's throw it in. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Bake It Up a Notch Bite Size, where we talked about one of my favorite things to make, grain crusts. This is a great way to remix leftovers. It's a great way to use naturally gluten-free grains to make a gluten-free crust alternative, and even a healthier crust alternative. Get some whole grains in there. There's a lot of great things that you can do with this one really simple base idea. So let's slice into a couple of these and get eating. And in the meantime, I want to wish you happy baking. Do you see the crispy part? Okay, good.